Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal.
I want to continue talking about the issue, whether positive or negative, of biblical criticism and how it pertains, oftentimes, and more often than not, I would say, to a heresy, a theological heresy, and also, I would say, a philosophical system called Modernism. Now, modernism is different than modern philosophy. Okay, not every modern philosopher is a modernist, and not every modernist is, in the chronological sense, a modern philosopher, although, most probably are. Modernism was actually the impetus for the calling of the First Vatican Council in the, what would it have been, 1860s, I believe, in the 1860s, maybe 1870s. The First Vatican Council, which only lasted a short period of time until being disbanded because of the Franco-Prussian War that broke out. The First Vatican Council was convened to deal with this heresy, this problem. And the key tenets of this heresy are a reduction of miracles to, you could say, literary elements, to metaphors, allegories, or possibly even just pure fiction. And this would go for miracles in Scripture and also miracles in the lives and hagiography of the saints, really miracles in general. Modernism will look at religion through really a secularist lens. And modernism was, you could say, the first fruit of secular culture. There was no single moment when modernism popped up. It was a slow build, just like the rise of secularism. It was a slow build. And its roots can go back all the way to the Middle Ages and before. One cannot blame the modern issues upon any one singular group, one singular person, one singular thinker or group of thinkers. It's a cultural movement. And cultural movements generally cannot be blamed upon one person. One person may be the catalyst for getting the movement going, but more often than not, it's a group of people who either are the catalysts or who, are the ones who start the movement. We see this in our own day with, you could say, woke liberalism or woke politics. One could reduce it back initially to maybe the Black Lives Matter movement or something along those lines. But its roots are much further before. Going back to all the riots in the 1990s, problems in the 80s, problems before that especially roots in segregational American culture and an 1800s culture of slavery. And the 1800s culture of slavery goes back hundreds of years, even thousands of years. Although I think one can make a pretty good argument that slavery didn't really exist, at least in Europe, during the Middle Ages. Slavery, as we saw it in the 15th and 16th centuries, was kind of where it started budding, and then especially in the 16th through 19th centuries, slavery really kind of took off, and a particularly savage form of slavery, which was racial slavery, took off, based upon many eugenic type ideas, and also the initial theory of evolution was a product of these racist theories, because people were trying to justify why blacks were less than human. And one of the initial theories was that people of African descent originated from monkeys, and therefore they were thought to be less than human. It's a tragic and despicable theory. Not trying to say that the theory of evolution as a whole, and especially as it's concepted today, is despicable. Certainly, in different aspects, it is still. The theory of evolution today still has eugenic roots. Still has, while people claim that all the racist tendencies have been purged out of it, racist conclusions can still be taken from certain evolutionary theories. Not all of them, but certain ones. But we're in a new age of not really racism, but of ageism, really. Either of the very young, babies, toddlers, but especially infants in the womb, and also of the very old. The geriatric abuse that goes on in our culture is abhorrent. The devaluing of elderly life, of sickly life in general, the devaluing of someone who is sick. Proponents of physician-assisted suicide or just suicide on its own have become more and more popular, which is a terrifying reality. A terrifying reality. So all these things are fruits of the modernist movement. And I think, as I was getting at in the last podcast, the biblical criticism movement has its origins in modernism as well. Now, I'm not making a genetic fallacy here. I acknowledge that just because something is rooted in a heretical or wrong point of view doesn't mean that it itself is wrong. Although a genetic fallacy, when applied to an argument's premise, is not wrong. It's no longer a fallacy. Saying that an argument comes from a bad premise is a valid argument. You can destroy arguments by destroying their premises. So I would say that many current errors in the church spring from this faulty fount of modernism. Historical criticism in itself is not bad. Looking back upon the scriptures with a historical lens, of course, is not bad. But doing so with the idea of undermining tradition can be bad. Why? Because of the attitude with which a scholar goes into doing such work. If he goes into doing biblical scholarship with the attitude of dismantling tradition instead of discovering the truth, he's already started on the wrong foot. If a scholar in any field comes into his scholarly work with anything other than seeking the truth, he is not being a scholar, but to use some fun verbiage, a scoundrel. He's not being a scholar, but a scoundrel. Now, everyone comes into their work with certain biases, and we need to try to identify those so that we can root them out. There is a legitimate place for Catholics to do biblical scholarship from a Catholic point of view, because the Bible is not, well, first off, the Bible has been interpreted from a Catholic point of view for 2,000 years. And I don't mean that. I mean that at least in the lower C sense. If you're a Protestant or Orthodox, you might take offense at that claim. You might say, "Oh, the Catholic Church was started in maybe the 700s or the 1054 AD or 1204 or whatever you want to say, 1517." Okay, fine. You're entitled to believe that. I don't. But for the sake of those listening, I'll say, even from a small c standpoint, individuals within their own theological framework should be able to do theological exegesis upon the scriptures. There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. There also shouldn't be anything wrong necessarily with a Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox trying to look at Scripture from a secularist point of view to understand where maybe secular scholars are coming from on these issues. But something is inherently dubious about coming to such a thing as Scripture for study and coming there only to dismantle it. Okay. A secular scholar, I would think, would be more than allowed to come to the Scripture from a purely historical point of view. But it doesn't mean, and the scholar should know this, it doesn't mean that if he does not find certain information for traditional assumptions, this does not mean he has found contrary information to these traditional assumptions. Okay, I think we've talked about this enough. I want to now move on to how we see modernism in the current day Catholic Church. And I think this is where I got off track on the last podcast. I went That was what I initially wanted to talk about, but I ended up getting hung up on historical criticism. So, how do we see modernism in the modern day Catholic Church? Or at least, how do we see things going on that are less than ideal, let's say? Well, I think it's good probably to address the elephant in the room first off. And that would be the sexual abuse scandals. Now, what was the root of these scandals? What is the current root of these scandals as they continue? Well, I would argue that the root is a compromise of morality. A compromise of morality. And especially a compromise of morality amongst the clergy. Especially a compromise of morality amongst the clergy. It is no secret that in the 1970s, 80s, into the 1990s, that seminaries and religious communities were bastions of homosexuality. It is no secret. There were even secular people who later harshly accused these clergymen and religious. There were secular people who lauded and praised this rampant homosexuality amongst these communities. They saw it as a liberation. And they applauded them until they went too far. So as Orthodox Catholics and Christians, we would say it was already too far once they started on this road towards homosexuality. And the whole aura of the time was, do what you feel. It still is this way. Do what you feel. If you feel a certain way, that's good. And now it's turning into, and has turned into, if you feel a certain way, that's who you are. And who you are is good, right? So, if how you feel is what you are, or who you are, then what's wrong with any feelings that come across your way? There are those now flaunting polyamory, I think is what it is called, polyamory, which is a non-marital state. In my understanding, this is different than polygamy. It is a non-marital state, only bound by the bonds of eros, you could say, of felt love, erotic love. There are many others who say, I feel like a woman when they're a man, or I feel like a man when they're a woman. And because of this, they mutilate themselves in horrific ways. Even children. Now this is where I not only scratch my head, where I am disgusted by the culture of this day. And it is where and when parents trying to be conciliatory towards their own children allow doctors to mutilate their children in ways that are just purely diabolical. Now, what is the difference between allowing your child to chop off their own genitals and allowing your child to have sex with an adult? Is there any difference? To have one deranged adult who is willing to chop off the genitals of a child versus another deranged adult who's willing to do whatever he wants with the genitals of a child? There is no difference. And this is the most despicable crime of our age. Thus far, at least. But I am sure there are many more to come. And I'm sure, actually I know, there are people currently trying to follow this logic to its conclusions and say, well, if this child wants to have sexual relations with me, who am I to stop them? You know who you are to stop them? Either you pedophile or you pedophilic doctor. Do you know who you are to stop them? You're the only one that can stop them at the last moment, before they make a decision, or a decision is thrust upon them, or they're coerced into a decision that they had no means or ability to make. And also a decision that has lifelong consequences. It is truly despicable, all of this. The transgender issues, especially when they regard children, but also when they regard adults. The pedophilia issue in every case whatsoever. The transgender issue in every case whatsoever as well. But when you take people's delusions and you tell them they're okay, or you applaud their delusions, you just multiply the delusions. You yourself become delusional.